If you're buying Bitcoin today and you're holding it over the next 4 years, maybe over the next 8 years, what kind of annual growth rate can we expect long term? I came up with two models to estimate this, and both models that are actually very different, they come up with very similar growth rates. Now the TLDR is that I believe Bitcoin will grow by roughly 32% per annum in the next 8 years. So in other words, you will get a 3x every 4 years, every cycle. And it's actually not that easy to come up with a somewhat reliable number, because what kind of starting and end points could we take historically to estimate growth rates? Because at the beginning, when Bitcoin was just a few cents, it grew way faster than it is now, which makes a lot of sense, right? This is a maturing asset and it takes more and more capital to double the price. And so what's a reasonable growth rate? Is it from the top over here to over here? Or is it maybe from the bottom here to over here? Or should we be more conservative and take the peak bottom to our current price? What kind of growth rates make sense? The main issue with coming up with a trustworthy estimation is the volatility in Bitcoin's price. Because depending on what point in time you take, you are off by more than 80% potentially, right? Bitcoin tends to crash quite a lot during the bear markets. I want to find out if we don't care about bull or bear market, if we simply just buy in and we buy this for the next 4 to 8 years, what can we realistically expect? Now let me show you the simple approach first. Instead of using market prices, why don't we take the realized price? So that's the average cost basis of the market, and that is way less volatile, and the actual price tends to hover around that. So to get a somewhat realistic growth rate, why don't we just take, to be somewhat conservative, the realized price at the peak of the last bull run in 2017, 2018, and compare this with the realized price right now. So with this approach, we're assuming that Bitcoin is actually quite a bit overvalued right now. But still, long term, the price hovers around the realized price, and that should be our long-term growth estimate. At least that's one approach. So let's take those 2 points over here to today. Here's the numbers. The realized price on the 1st of January 2018 was at 5,335. The realized price today is at a bit under 30,000. So 6.55 years have passed. The price has increased by 5.8x. And that is annualized a growth rate of 31%. So if we take that growth rate and set it to the power of 4, so we have 4 years of that kind of growth, we are looking at almost a 3x. So it's a 3x per cycle. You put in 100,000 today, you will have 300,000 roughly in 4 years, or potentially 900,000 in 8 years. But that of course assumes that you're buying and selling exactly at the realized price. So when you're currently buying a 2x above the realized price and you're not going to buy further when we are below the realized price, that return might of course be lower. Now, why is Bitcoin growing by that much every year, by more than 30%? I believe it's because of the long-term holder adoption, right? More and more Bitcoin gets simply just acquired by long-term holders, by the diamond hands. And so the fraction of Bitcoin that doesn't move year over year tends to increase. And when an asset is limited in supply and the long-term holders scoop up more and more of it, then the price tends to rise long-term. And I've attempted to measure this, the long-term holder adoption and its impact on the price. And this in the end brings us to a very similar growth rate. Let me show you the model. Let's first talk about the supply that gets bought up by the ETFs that everybody is talking about. This is the number of Bitcoin on the left and the percent supply on the right since the ETF launch in January of this year. So this looks at the new ETFs minus the grayscale Bitcoin trust balance. And let's ignore, again, because we want to be conservative, let's ignore the initial hype, the initial rush into the ETF, and let's simply work with this point over here and compare it to this point over here. How much long-term do we see demand getting locked up in the Bitcoin ETFs? We've got the 18th of March 2024, where 1.11% was in those ETFs, so that's over here. And then we've got today, where we are at 1.38%. So we've got 120 days that we're measuring. Over that time frame, 0.27% of Bitcoin got scooped up by the ETFs. That means per annum, we are getting 0.82% that gets into those ETFs. Again, we try to be conservative here, right? But it's 0.82% simply just based on the last few months. Now what's very interesting is that that number is pretty much in the same ballpark as the Bitcoin mining, the annualized Bitcoin mining output. So Bitcoin supply is still growing, but it's currently growing by roughly 0.85% per annum. So the ETF demand and the additional supply through mining pretty much offsets one another. And so what I believe is the real catalyst here is this chart. This is the Bitcoin that hasn't moved for the last 5 years. So this is partially lost Bitcoin. It's also Bitcoin that's simply just held by the long-term holders, right? And this tends to grow quite consistently over time. Let's again be conservative. Let's take 2016 over here, where we didn't grow that much yet, where we were at 17% of all of Bitcoin being in the long-term holders' hands. And let's compare this to the value today, where it's roughly 31% of all of Bitcoin in those long-term holders' hands. How quickly did we grow? Here are the numbers. We are looking at 8 years. We are looking at a 14 percentage point increase. That's per annum 1.8%. So the long-term holders on chain, or the people that simply lose their Bitcoin, they scoop up 1.8% of Bitcoin supply every year roughly. It's more than double of what's been bought through the Bitcoin ETFs in the last months. Now 1.8% per annum does not sound like a lot whatsoever, right? Is this our expected return? The answer is no, because there is a leverage effect, right? If you put $1,000 into Bitcoin, the market cap of Bitcoin grows by much more than $1,000. And the way to potentially estimate that leverage effect is to look at how much is the price going up when all the short-term holders jump onto the Bitcoin train. So instead of looking at the long-term holders that continue to accumulate, let's have a look at the short-term holders that sometimes buy in when everything is super hyped and then sell off when the price turns around. So what we're looking at here is the percent of Bitcoin supply that's in the wallets that didn't hold it for longer than 6 months. And so again, let's be conservative. Let's take this point over here where there was not a lot of short-term holders, where the price was roughly at 11K. And let's compare this to when a lot of short-term holders bought into Bitcoin, when the price was at rather 36K. So the delta in terms of percent held by those short-term holders grew to 11%, and the price made a 5.7x due to that demand. And so let's combine this with the long-term holder metric. We know that per annum it's 1.8% that's been scooped up by the long-term holders. So how many years does it take to generate this 11% delta, not with short-term holder money, but with long-term holder money? The answer is 6.3 years. So it takes 6.3 years to make a 5.7x. What's the annualized growth rate based on that? 32%. Isn't that fascinating? If you look at the realized price growth rate, or if you look at simply how much is been held by the long-term holders, how quickly is that growing and how much price impact does that growth have? When we look at both of those very different kinds of models, we get a very similar growth rate. Long-term around 32% per annum, or roughly a 3x in terms of US dollars every 4 years, every cycle. Now this is an estimate as any other estimate, and of course nobody can truly say where the Bitcoin price will be in 4 or 8 years. If we take the current realized price, so not the current price, but the realized price, then the estimate would be that in 8 years the price is at roughly $280,000. And so if you want to be a millionaire in 8 years, you have to own roughly 4 Bitcoin, right? A bit under 4 Bitcoin. I find this fascinating. It only takes 1.8% of all of Bitcoin supply to move for the price to move by more than 30%. And that's why we've got these massive ups and downs in the price, right? It doesn't take a lot of people to sell for the price to crash. But that, on the other hand, also means it doesn't take too much money for the price to outgrow all the other long-term assets, right? If you want to grow more than the stock market or the property market, then Bitcoin is probably the best long-term bet, right? What else can you buy and hold for 8 years with such a growth prospect? I've personally split up my portfolio in various different buckets, right? I've got stock, I've got property, I've got long-term government bonds, and I've got crypto. And the crypto I'm splitting up into 2 separate baskets as well. I've got one portion of crypto that's pure native Bitcoin that is simply dollar cost average in, and where I do not even try to attempt to time the market. So I simply just buy this in order to hold this over those next 4 or 8 years. The other part of the crypto portfolio is not native Bitcoin. That's maybe wrapped Bitcoin on Ethereum or on another chain. This is where I do DeFi plays. This is where I get on more risk. And that's where I then measure the performance versus the native Bitcoin, right? If I cannot outperform buying and holding Bitcoin with taking on more risk, then I'm obviously doing something wrong. Historically, so over the last 2.5 years, I outperformed buying and holding Bitcoin by roughly 15% per annum. So I'm not 10xing my capital every year, but I am getting somewhat more return. And when you multiply the 30% per annum that Bitcoin makes with another 15% per annum alpha, you are at 50% per annum. That's really nice return. But again, it's only one part of the portfolio. And again, this does fluctuate a lot. There's a ton of volatility. That's why we want to own everything, right? And because of that massive volatility in Bitcoin, because it can easily drop 50% by just a few people selling, it does make sense to own everything, that once we do see prices potentially below the realized price, that we can then sell some stock or some long-term government bonds and to buy in heavily. If you've got Telegram and you haven't yet joined our channel, feel free to do so. The link is down below. Looking very much forward to chatting with you. Cheers.